Happy Monday, and welcome to another episode of Cases That Should Have Gone to the Supreme Court of Canada, but didn't. Today we're talking about COVID-19 public health orders. Cases that should have gone to the Supreme Court of Canada, but didn't. Stanislav Bricka was an individual affected by the Ontario government's COVID-19 health orders. He essentially argued that the government did not have the ability to create public health orders related to COVID-19, but also to use its regulatory power to effectively create penal consequences for violating those orders. As everybody recalls, when we were in the midst of COVID-19, governments were passing regulations very quickly to try and impose consequences to make people follow the orders, including the imposition of periods of jail. Mr. Bricka argued that using a regulatory power in the context of an emergency to impose a penal consequence, as opposed to doing this through the proper legislative process, was an unreasonable exercise of the government's discretion to use its regulatory power, and filed for judicial review. Ultimately, his judicial review application was dismissed. He appealed unsuccessfully and sought leave to the Supreme Court of Canada, who did not accept the application. Now, it may be that the Supreme Court of Canada didn't hear this case because the COVID-19 regulations at issue no longer exist, because the pandemic is something that we are very close to moving beyond. But that doesn't eliminate the legal issue that is at the center of this. And since we have now seen a use of our legal and regulatory public health powers done in a way in every province and territory in Canada that was never done before in our legal system, don't we deserve some commentary on the Supreme Court of Canada about how far governments can go and what governments must do to address this issue of delay and to address this issue of imposing orders that result in true penal consequences for individuals simply by virtue of regulation, with no debate and with less ability to challenge the government's decision and with less notice to the public? It certainly seems that sort of endorsing or implicitly endorsing a government's power to do this leaves the door open for abuse. And while nobody can deny that the COVID-19 pandemic was not and has not been an incredibly serious public health issue, what public health issue can be characterized as something that is regulatory, where the government can impose penal consequences, and one that is not serious enough that the government can use its regulatory powers to impose penal consequences is not entirely clear at this point. Effectively, a provincial government can declare a public emergency about any issue and then impose regulatory consequences and effectively have the right to impose jail sentences on individuals for violating those regulations, despite the fact that the emergency may not, in fact, be a true emergency, but may be enough to justify the test for an emergency in the context of what is set out in the public health legislation. This arms the governments with far more power than they should have and raises significant concerns about the fairness of the government's regulatory abilities. The Supreme Court of Canada should have had the opportunity and taken the opportunity to deal with that exercise of power without having to get into whether or not it was justified in the context of COVID-19. And unfortunately, they didn't do it. I hope that we don't see a situation where governments abuse the powers that have implicitly been granted to them as a result of what they've done during COVID to prevent individuals from properly having fair trials, properly exercising their public rights, and face penal consequences as a result. Cases that should have gone to the Supreme Court of Canada, but didn't. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Cases That Should Have Gone to the Supreme Court of Canada but Didn't. I'm Kyla Lee at Acumen Law. Thank you to Brazen Bull Creative for putting together these videos. Please like, subscribe, and share with your friends.